So welcome. This is our fireside chat, as you can see by our lovely little fire that's burning in the background. I'd just like to have each of the panelists introduce themselves.
My name is Don Hubbard. I'm Vice President of Sales and Marketing with Checkpoint Surgical. I've been in the medical sales space, selling to a variety of different constituents groups for about the last 15 years. Prior to that, a few other firms would had successful exits, so for what that's worth.
Stephanie Harrington, CEO of Matrix Medical Devices. I've been in medical devices for 20 years in a variety of roles, but from engineering to regulatory to clinical to operations. So we'll sort of bring hopefully some of the tactical experience and how we help people like Jacqueline and Don bring those products to market.
Hi, I'm Marilyn Denegri-Rumbin. I'm the Director of Payer and Reimbursement Strategies at Cardinal Health. I have extensive background for 25 years from hospital administration, practice management, healthcare consulting. My primary focus has been the last 15 years on pre-commercialization of medical devices and emerging technologies with obtaining health policy, coding, coverage, and payment.
Great. And again, I'm Jacqueline Murray, and I'm with DardenLentz, which is a marketing and branding agency, and I'm going to be hosting the fireside chat. As I mentioned in the first part, we're going to talk about claims in this section. And by claims in this case, we're referring to those things that that are the intended use. They are the performance claims that you're going to make about your product. And it's a really important part of your overall strategy is developing that claim. So we've devoted a little bit of time today to this topic and with our expert panel. We're going to cover a number of different areas. That is the importance of having a claims strategy, the different types of claims that you might have, and then a number of strategic questions around developing your claims plan for your product, and then supporting those claims. So that's kind of the overall for today. We'd like to start off with talking about claims and introducing the topic of claims. I was going to turn it over to Stephanie to do that.
Great. But you're going to drive for me?
Yes.
So Jacqueline touched on it a little bit, and we're not going to get too much into the details of the regulatory side, but in the area of medical devices, it is a regulated industry. So in the U.S., we have FDA, and outside of the U.S., we have notified bodies and CE marking or other agencies like FDA. And so one of the biggest challenges for startup companies as well as established companies is that balance of investing in a product development pathway that will end up with a product in the market that will be saleable by your marketing team. So it's a balance between the marketing and the regulatory path, and developing a strategy that will allow you to come to market as quickly as possible, but also have the claims that you need to sell the product with the lowest regulatory risk. And it is not something that is done once. It is an iteration, as Jacqueline said, and I call it basically a negotiation across the cross-functional team throughout the entire development process. So I thought I like case studies because I think they're always really helpful. So I thought it would be useful just to take a look at one example of where regulatory strategies play very impactfully into product types. So in this case, what I'm showing basically is we have an imaging system that has a very broad intended use claim with a short regulatory pathway. So it got to market very quickly through a 510(k) process. And that was our Imolux OCT imaging system. Imolux was a startup company here in Cleveland, Ohio, and really fabulous technology, near surface imaging. But our strategy was to use X-ray imaging type claims, where basically the claim was the specification of the image. Versus, on the other right-hand side, we have a device called the Luma Cervical Imaging System. This was a company that chose to basically go for a claim for detecting precancerous conditions. So you can see in one case we have a device that creates an image, and that is the claim that we can say about the device. In the other case, we have a very sophisticated claim to be able to detect abnormal tissue for potential treatment. So on the left-hand side, the intended use claim was very broad. It allowed the investment for that company to be minimal on a relative scale. and to then bring that product to market through a 510K clearance pathway, which is a lower regulatory path with the FDA. On the right-hand side, it was over $60 million in investment. It was over 10,000 patients to demonstrate that clinical claim of detection of precancerous tissue. But at the end, Jacqueline and Don's and their company could go out and say, you know, we can detect cancerous tissue, we can help you, you know, doctor, clinician, nurse practitioner in helping patients, you know, health and overall quality. So it's just an example of basically the spectrum. In the left-hand side, on the Emmelec side, unfortunately that company was not successful, because one of the things that I think, you know, Marilyn's going to touch on as well, and Jacqueline touched on too, is it's not just the FDA clearance, it's who's going to buy the system. So if the system doesn't say it can detect cancerous tissue, how are you going to convince that clinician to spend $70,000 or whatever it is to buy that capital system? Becomes very delicate, as Jacqueline hinted to, on your labeling strategy, and imaging is in particular one area that FDA and software has a lot of attention to, how a company presents itself. And so it can take a long time, and you know, that ramp rate up rate on revenue you know, is not what was expected, because you need the key opinion leaders to really help force adoption and drive adoption. So it's just an example of how two different ends of the regulatory spectrum impacted equality of the company.
Great. I think that set the stage really, really nicely to really move into what are those things that you need to ask yourself as an organization strategically. And you know, one of the first things from a strategy perspective is, who do you need to engage in your claims strategy? You know, who do you need to involve in order to start building that plan? So Marilyn, you want to start?
Sure. I come from, of course, the reimbursement perspective. So I always say, it's show me the money. How are we going to get paid for the investment we're going to have with a medical device or with a new technology? To build upon that, it's threefold. One is, of course, we're looking for coding, and that's actually how a product will actually be coded, if it's a product or service, so that in fact consumers as well as hospitals and physicians can actually be reimbursed for that product. In conjunction with that, we need coverage, which is medical policy, showing what the attributes are of the product, what in fact it was through regulatory and clinical, how it was designed and what the efficacy of that product is, what the quality, what in fact what the benefit is as well. And then again, it is also the payment. How are we going to be paid? So is it going to come off a Medicare fee schedule? Is it something that's going to be out of pocket for a consumer? These are really very important questions, but I'm going to digress just 1 minute as to where the reimbursement piece actually falls into the spectrum. Normally when I do a presentation too on pre-commercialization of a product, I demonstrate how important each one of the areas that are brought together within a company are critical in the decision making, literally putting the puzzle pieces together. So clinical, regulatory, marketing, as well as reimbursement have to be very cohesive. We have to be working together from the beginning of development throughout the pre-commercialization stage, post 510K, as well as when we're going to work on our market access. So I think that's really important, is understanding that you just don't jump into development without actually bringing everybody together. And actually, you've brought that out in your discussion earlier, and so I just want to leverage that again and reemphasize the importance of it.
And what about other external constituents that are involved? So we've talked about the coding and reimbursement. What about from the customer side? Who are the stakeholders there?
Well, definitely. Don, do you want to start with?
Well, I mean, obviously you have to engage the KOLs. You have to make sure that that all parties are heard, if you will. You can't do it in a silo. And so, you know, kind of the message you've been hearing throughout the morning so far is that there's lots of people involved in the process, and you need to make sure that you're engaging all of them early and often. And you're making sure that you're getting that feedback loop before you really charge off in any given direction.
Just back to you for a second, Marilyn. One of the things that, picking up off of what Dawn just said about keeping lots of other stakeholders involved, I think you had some examples when we talked previously about benchmarking and about choosing the right benchmarks.
Yes. One of the areas, in fact, that when I work on a new technology or medical device, is that I'm also looking at what is coming out of CMS and the FDA. And to use an example, right now they're looking at new alternative payments. But one of the ways to actually, CMS is looking to move products more quickly into the market is they actually have an innovation center. And within this innovation center, the CMMI is actually looking to partner with new technologies so that not only do you have your 510K in process, but they will work with the AMA on with your coding, and in fact, then with CMS on your payment and coverage issues. Right now, there's only been one that has been successful to go through that process, but CMS is actually very interested in moving through that. So it's nice to, if you're looking for that criteria, to find out what it is so you can expedite your process. I think one of the things that most people don't understand with the 510K process is you might have your studies done, you might have your product going through the 510K, and you don't have your coding. Well, the current process is you have to wait for your 510K, then look for those timelines when you can make your application. It could be anywhere from 18 to 36 months for you to receive a code. That means your product is in limbo. So if there's a way to actually step back, be able to facilitate your coding, payment, and coverage issues, you're saving not only millions of dollars, but you're also allowing a new product to be able to access the market more quickly. So I do want to highlight that there are opportunities out there to be able to do that.
And if I can add on,
Sure.
I mean, I think Maryland's segment in the world of reimbursement, which is very, very niche-y,
Yes,
very
it is.
specialized, is definitely one that is brought in way too late, at least in my experience. And truly, it can make or break. I mean, it can be the deciding factor in an indication for use claim. Because if your product is $200, but without going through that 36-month process, you're going to be in a code category that reimburses for $5, there's no market. So it really is something that's important to bring in early and feed into that process.
I would agree with that. Many times I've said that pre-commercialization is bring reimbursement in on the onset. Let us do the analysis right away. Let's see if there's a code that already can be used. If we know we need a new application, the other thing is to piggyback that into your studies, because there's data that has to be collected during that study. You're spending millions of dollars. It's so important if you can even meet with your payers. Say, what are you going to need if I have this technology? What will you need from me to demonstrate the value, efficacy, the quality of this product, and what it is that actually is in alignment with the payer strategy, because they're also under constraints. So if you can become a good partner, you have great opportunity and success.
And when we talked earlier, you mentioned, so I like always the case
that's
study
good.
example. Could you comment a little bit on the Charité, the artificial disc, and
Yes.
the initial reimbursement? I think it's important to realize how critical this area is.
What she's referring to is I worked on the J&J Charité artificial disc, and that was a new technology that came out for spinal implants. What we found is that we were not in the early process of when the studies were done, when in fact they were going to have the product for market access. And then they brought, of course, a team in and said, okay, we need coding, coverage, and payment. Well, we did expedite this, but this was 18 months after we had gotten our 510K. And unfortunately, the sales strategy was that now that you have a code and we have a few med policies, we don't need reimbursement anymore. And if you'll notice, you don't hear anything about that wonderful technology anymore, and yet this was cutting edge in spine. So it's really sad because clinical, regulatory, and I would say marketing and sales were not on the same page with reimbursement. It was an afterthought.
They designed all these clinical studies to demonstrate the efficacy, to get
Yes.
through, and the safety to get through FDA. They benchmarked against a plate, a metal
Yes.
plate.
Oh, yes.
So the product was $15,000, this artificial disc, against a $1,000 plate.
Yes.
So the reimbursement coverage was $1,000. I mean, I'm exaggerating slightly, but, and that's, you know, and hundreds of patients later was this realized, and so, I mean, it can't be overemphasized, I guess.
Right.
I just want to add, though, for people that aren't pursuing a reimbursement strategy, which my company does not. And we've been very successful so far without a reimbursement strategy because, candidly, the qualifications and the criteria that are established right now for reimbursement of our product, which is a relatively low-cost disposable, it's anywhere from $350 to $550 depending on which device is utilized per procedure, is absorbed as part of the DRG. So that cost is absorbed as part of the, if you will, the cost of the procedure itself. When we looked into reimbursement, what we realized was the criteria that were written currently that would make our product, you know, applicable had to be massively rewritten because they were antiquated. Our technology leapfrogged, you know, what the FDA and the payers had sort of outlined as a requirement, and we had the new technology. And we had a new clinical application that had never been looked at before. So we had to make a decision at that point of whether we wanted to wait and pursue the path of getting it rewritten or wait and redesign our product to fit an antiquated, if you will, qualification, or commercialize. And we decided to commercialize. And we commercialized without a reimbursement in place. Would it be more helpful?
Just somebody that was
Absolutely.
your reimbursement strategy, right?
Yep. So would it be more helpful? Would it be better? Yeah, of course it would be better, but it wasn't necessary. So I just want to make sure anybody here that has think that, oh God, I don't have I don't have this coded right, I'm doomed.
Right.
You may not be. I mean, don't look at it that way.
Absolutely not. Yes. Yes.
Right. I would agree. I would agree.
I think that's a really good point to bring out. Stephanie, you talked a little bit about having the regulatory strategy in place. Can you define for this audience off-label and give us just a little bit of a flavor for how labeling and claims fits together?
So, and when Jacqueline first suggested this topic, I said, well, that's a whole, like she said, that's a whole nother seminar or panel at some point. But definitely an area that FDA has a lot of attention focused on, and it is very challenging to walk in that gray zone, as I call it. So I like to go back to examples, talking about the case study that we had before. So now in the example of Imilux, my intended use claim that I gave to marketing and regulatory was imaging at 1 micron depth with 10 microns of resolution. And we had all these lovely research papers over here that said this technology could be used for, precancerous condition of cervical cancer, bladder cancer, The challenge now is how do we, Imilux, present that to you, the clinician, in order to buy it? And it becomes very challenging because marketing cannot say it can be used to detect cancer. See, look, here are all these research articles. So it's a very delicate line of being able to refer your potential customers and buyers to a list of research articles, and ultimately, it's FDA now is working much more closely with the companies and have included, they've added claims or warnings if they feel that the indication is too broad and they feel that there is the potential for off-label use. So.
Marilyn, can you comment about reimbursement and off-label use?
One of the things that we actually shared earlier was that in reimbursement, when we're educating hospitals, physicians, and consumers, is that we explain that, in fact, if you are performing a procedure or using a medical device off-label, that in fact it could nullify your reimbursement. So even though you might have a denied claim, what happens is that it is likely that it will be, through the appeal process, it would not be overturned. And the reason they do this, and many companies also usually go through that criteria, especially they want to communicate that with sales, so that what happens is that there are liability issues involved, and they want to eliminate those liability issues for utilization of a technology or a procedure for a number of reasons. But of course, too, it could also, and you might clarify this for me too, it might also cause a problem with the 510K, that it can be withdrawn. And so, you know, people are very, very careful with that. But, you know, the thing is, too, the responsibility then for the cost would fall either on the hospital or the patient to actually absorb that cost if, in fact, it's not reimbursed through normal channels.
I would simply add a couple thoughts. One is, as it relates to your marketing and off-label usage, there's a really easy, I learned this the hard way, not through any kind of regulatory issue, but just having my hands smacked by people like yourselves constantly internally.
Sure.
First and foremost.
It's a healthy crosswalk.
Yeah.
Have them up here.
We have the scars.
This was the first lesson I learned. Adjectives are bad. Okay, so you can't say good, better, best, great. Can't. Forget adjectives, okay? The regulatory people would like it if every one of my marketing campaigns was checkpoint is this, and no adjectives, no anything. Right. Secondly, the surgeons will use your product off-label. Know that right in advance. They will. They'll experiment. They'll play with it. If it's a good product, they'll use it in all kinds of different ways you never even thought of. Yeah. That's okay. They can do what they want. What you can't do is tell them to do it, promote doing it. You can't, you know, there's absolutely no stipulations for their usage of it off-label, so don't, you know, get scared if they do, but understand that what you can't do, even if you see an incredibly, what looks like a good application of your product, okay, and we have that with my company, where I'll watch a surgeon do it and use it in a way like, wow, that's cool, I wish I could tell people about it, but I can't. So it just that's the one thing I would sort of, as an admonition, no surgeons will use it, not in the way that you intended or thought of, and know that you can't tell anybody about it. That's probably the biggest thing. You can't advertise or promote that usage.
We're going to change gears just a little bit, and you know, we've been talking about claims, and I think it's important to give a little bit more general information. So there's kind of two big categories of claims. There's the claims that are your clinical claims, and then the claims that are your economic claims, or the value that you bring. I was wondering if, you know, the team could talk a little bit, and we'll start with you, Dawn, about the kinds of questions you should ask yourself as you're developing what claims are going to be important for you.
Okay. Well, the very first question you have to ask yourself as a medical device, you know, curator, owner, is what problem am I solving? Because you better, in today's world, I will tell you right now, you had better solve one of two problems at the hospital level. If you don't, you're going to have a real rough ride. The first problem is, are you taking cost out of the equation? Is your product replacing another product and reducing cost at the hospital level? Or are you solving and improving patient outcomes? Are you providing better clinical benefit? If your product, you can't stand on a chair and say, we absolutely do this, you are in deep trouble from day one. So I would simply encourage you, before you employ any type of a clinical strategy, to say to yourself, what am I validating? What is the so what? So that if I come to the end of this study and I've proven something, have I proven one of those two things? Prove patient outcomes, save money. Because if the answer to those two questions is not sure, or I can't really connect the dots, or maybe, save the money. Nobody cares. Because right now, in today's, believe me, with Obamacare in place, with the very rapidly changing hospital environment, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later, you had really better be able to solve one of those problems and solve it well.
That's great. Anything else from the team to add?
Yeah, I just think some of the comments you made in your presentation, you know, about starting early, starting iteratively with a cross-functional team at the table, that is FDA's regulation. I mean, that is the basis for design controls, and there's a reason why FDA wants to do that. I mean, it identifies the weaknesses and the strengths of the product early in the process, so that it can be verified and validated effectively. So I think it's important.
And I'm just going to comment with and add to what Dawn is saying. Many times in reimbursement, I've been called in to speak to people in the C-suite to actually talk about the reimbursement for what the health economic value, the value proposition is, also to discuss what in fact they can do to leverage their contracts, from obtaining a higher reimbursement. So sometimes I go through contract strategies as well. And that's of value to hospitals and physicians if they haven't thought about what is it with my product. Like if it's a medical device, we can use the Charité artificial disc. One of the strategies that I had used with the C-suite is actually showing them how to renegotiate, not on top of their DRG, their case rate, to actually go back and actually get reimbursement on invoice. So it could be procedure plus invoice, and to write that in to have a carve out on their contracts so that they can maximize that reimbursement, because that artificial disc was $10,000. And if you're only going to be reimbursed $3,000 for a spine surgery, the hospital is at a loss. So showing them that there's not going to be a loss, showing them how their physician, because of the expertise on the technology, can also be reimbursed outside the case rate, is advantage to a selling point, in a sense, to a physician. And then outlining what they can do through an appeal process to maximize reimbursement as well.
Yeah, and that's a really good point, because this really moves us into the next topic about how you are supporting those claims. And so that's an example of some of the things that you can do to help your to help support the claims at an economic level. What are some of the other things that companies can do to build that support for their claims? You know, and obviously clinical trials is a big part of that. So I'll turn it over to maybe Stephanie first.
Well, and I think you gave a great example in your presentation where, you know, if 1 pound is the lightest and the best, then, you know, engineering is set out to meet that objective. And if we come back with 1.5 pounds, if that's enough, then that is a good way to demonstrate it. So it doesn't have to always be clinical data. And a lot of the companies, which is nice, is, you know, between either testing standards or with white papers and other things, will benchmark their product against other products using preclinical benchtop type tests. And those are very powerful as well to be able to, but again, that is documentation, that is labeling, and so it's reviewed carefully, make sure that we're not saying the best when we shouldn't be saying that, that too strongly or whatever.
I'm going to add a different dimension to this too. One of the things that for new technologies that I've explored is also looking for beta projects. So from a reimbursement perspective for market access is looking at with payers as well as with CMS, the opportunities with new alternative payment models as well. To use an example, right now in oncology, they have, it just came out of the current administration, Moonshot. It was for oncology, that they're actually looking for new technologies, new ways of reimbursement, and this is a new opportunity too for companies that are in this area that are now exploring an opportunity for a 510K. There might be a way to actually expedite that process. In addition, we look at the beta projects. What are the key things that payers are looking at? Are they looking at readmission rates? Are they looking at a disease state? Does your product align with any of these payers or with CMS that actually can reduce costs, reduce admission rates, improve quality? That's the big thing right now on the agenda for CMS is any quality indicators will actually increase reimbursement for physicians and hospitals. And this is key because their reimbursement is actually shrinking. And they're feeling that pinch. So if we can help with what we're offering through a medical device or a procedure, doctors are going to gravitate toward that as well. But I've in the past have actually worked on beta projects with payers that will say, actually we can use this with Neuronetics, is that they have a wonderful technology on TMS, transcranial magnetic energy. With this, we were able to do beta projects that actually demonstrated that this new technology would diminish readmission rates, pharmaceutical usages, and increases in productivity. And within that study, we were able to, for treatment of depression, we demonstrated that actually that treatment cost, though it might be more expensive through 30 days of treatment versus just pharmaceutical utilization, we were able to demonstrate that it did work. And patients actually did very well. Some of them returned to work. Some of them are able to function again. So
That was a really interesting regulatory strategy. too.
yes, yes, it was.
A de novo.
You're right. So here it is. You have to be creative. You have to figure out what someone else is looking at from a payer perspective to see if in fact you can piggyback off it, so to speak, or be a good partner. And I think that's the big thing in healthcare today. We might not like Obamacare. I know sometimes I'm resistant, but the fact is, it's opportunity here. I think that's why you'll see through the Healthcare Land Network that groups, employer groups and physician groups, hospital groups are coming together to look at alternative payment models, because we have to be proactive. It's actually what we're going to have to utilize and maximize.
And if I can add just one of the things that I think is not usually the norm, has changed over the last 5 to 10 years, is really working with FDA and CMS very early in the process.
Yes.
And I've gone for pre-submission meetings with the FDA, and they've said, I think we should bring in CMS because they're familiar enough to know that there may be an issue. So, they are really trying to work with new technologies, especially that, and if they can help reduce cost and improve quality of life and outcome, they are very interested. So.
I would, again, not being a contrarian, just offering a alternative way of looking at the universe.
There is the regulatory and marketing divide.
The clinical study that they're referencing, that wonderful outcome that you achieved that was your holy grail, that's the one that you can go to a potential acquirer and say, look what we can do. It takes a long time, is extremely expensive. What was that one slide we looked at early on? 10,000 patient study. Do you know how long it takes to complete a 10,000 patient study? I don't care what your product does. And they had $60 million in capitalization, right? So most of us in this room, at least I can only speak for myself, but I'm going to guess most of us in this room don't have $60 million liquid, nor do we have 10,000 patients lined up for a study. So we have to look at alternative ways of commercializing our product. Now, in our case, we build sequentially to the clinical data. When we commercialized, first and foremost, we went to the KOLs and we said, will you say nice things about us? Can we publish nice things to tell other physicians that you like our product?
And
so
they
that was
didn't bring
kind
the
of
regulatory.
That was kind of number one. Number two, after they said yes, they said, will you write a white paper? Putting in writing how you use our product, and can we video you doing it? Can we show other surgeons you utilizing our product? So we were building kind of a case, we were building our clinical case, if you will, before the clinical studies are completed. What abstracts that were out there that supported the use of our technology, not speaking directly to it because we were new, but supporting the use of this type of technology. So we put together a fairly robust clinical evidence piece that I could show a surgeon and say, look, here are other surgeons using our device. Here are the white papers supporting how they use it. Here are the abstracts that support that you should use it. And here are the words of other surgeons telling you why it's a wonderful product and you should try it. Because at the end of the day, what you're really trying to do is get a surgeon to go in, or a physician or anyone else, to try your product and then draw the opinion, yeah, it has value and I'm going to use it again, right? That's what we're here to do. So, I just want to make sure everybody understands that while that is the be-all and end-all, I will freely admit it, there's a lot of stuff you can do in advance of it to keep your product and your commercialization strategy rolling.
Well, I think that brings us to another, and really important point to bring out is that, the planning of it. There's certainly things you can do early on in the process or without it, but having a clinical plan is really essential. And can you talk to that just a little bit?
Yes, absolutely. So again, and that's all part of your commercialization planning process, with the reimbursement side as well. But typically, one of the most important steps is really defining whether or not a tiered sequential stepwise pathway is possible, and there is enough market value and potential revenue and reimbursement to support that tiered lower regulatory path, or truly is it the end game, right? So again, looking at examples, so for stroke therapy, for example, maybe an indication is you're just increasing or maintaining blood flow in an ischemic area. That's not saying that you're improving outcome of stroke. That is a anatomical indication. You're improving blood flow in a specific area. And so those are things. But if that indication isn't going to convince a clinician to buy it, only 2 KOLs or key opinion leaders are going to be interested in purchasing that for their own research, then maybe truly working with FDA and CMS on the quality of life outcome improvement is the better path to take. And so defining that up front is, and iterating, obviously, as you learn more information.
I think, too, to piggyback on this, I think, too, what's really important is to know what you're aiming at. A clinical study takes, as we said earlier, they take a long time to complete. They do. I mean, 12 months, 18 months, 2 years, that's pretty standard. So if you're going to start something that takes that long to complete and that much capital to complete, number one, when you get to the finish line way out there, you better have a result that matters. That when you go back to commercialization, you can say to a surgeon or anyone else, look what we just proved for you. So it has to matter. Now in the case, I think it's kind of ironic in the case of my firm, the clinical study that we would have run probably day one of our commercialization is not the one that we've got going on right now, because we had some user experience that sort of pointed us in a slightly different direction that said this was more important to us. Now when we were designing the product and getting ready to go to market, we thought this would be important. And it's important, but not as important as this area over here. So because this area over here, which my product does very well, quite honestly, the surgeons don't believe it. So I had to validate that, because me telling them that, then me showing them videos, they're going, right. So I have to have a clinical study to be able to put some teeth behind it so that they realize it actually does it. So, what's the old axiom in carpentry? Measure twice, cut once. I think that it very much applies to your clinical study. Make darn sure that when you start the project, A, when you get to the finish line, it matters, and B, you get the desired results. Because if, again, it can doom companies if it's not done properly.
I would agree. That primary and secondary research is also so critical when you're doing your product design. I think it goes back to what we had started initially to say, actually the puzzle pieces coming together, marketing, clinical, regulatory, and reimbursement. When you know what you're going to need, that you've done your a deep dive as to what's going to be needed to save time, money, and costs, and that you can move your product. I happen to agree with you.
And I think getting that feedback as early as possible, even with prototypes on cadavers or or test articles, whatever it is, it's important, because a lot of times this inventor has a great idea and he or she just happens to be the only person in the world that can actually do that great idea. And so getting that feedback and understanding how your product or technology is going to fit and integrate into the entire flow. I mean, you don't know what you don't know until you get it out there.
And the other caveat with studies is that payers, including CMS, do not like studies that come from Europe or other parts of the world. They want them done here because our criteria is different and it's more measurable. So that's another thing. You can do a comparative study maybe to a study that was done in Europe, but they actually would almost want you to do it all over again and remeasure.
And it's not really necessarily part of this, but just touched on something. I just wanted to just kind of a call out to the room. Be careful that your KOLs don't drive your product, marketability, because they have a loud voice and a seat at the table. We have a little product that was developed for the checkpoint because a loud KOL who had a particular problem, wanted it solved, got us to go off on a product development path that when I engaged, and this is a good example of the early one about getting all the constituents, by the time sales got involved, I'm looking at it going, who on earth is ever going to buy this, right? And I mean, it was solving a problem, but it was solving a problem that occurred 6 times a year.
Right.
So, wonderful that we solved this 6-time-a-year problem for this one surgeon, but we were spending a lot of money on something because, he was saying, we need this. And so just when you touched on that, I just wanted to piggyback that. Just be careful.
Yeah, so we've touched on a topic about how claims impact your product development process. I mean, I think that's what we've been kind of talking about here. Are there other things that you need to consider relative to claims and product development? We've just kind of touched on that subject, but any other comments from the team?
So, I mean, I think one thing I always encourage as part of the and on the commercialization plan, right? So you get the business, the market landscape, the competition. But take advantage of the regulatory data, and good regulatory folks will be, they're part of the team. They're not the people that just say no and there's the line, because sometimes I think we're put in that box, but we don't mean to be. But there's a lot of information out there. So, for example, for a product in stroke or nerve stimulation, doing research on regulatory database of what serious injuries have happened, what are the risks that are out there, what are the failure points, have there been recalls? Understanding the regulatory competitive landscape can be incredibly informative as far as defining features that could be valuable, but also identifying your risks for hazards and other things in the product development.
It's also very effective in sales. If you go to our website, there's an entire section, we have abstracts that speak absolutely nothing about Checkpoint Surgical, but talk about nerve protection in surgery. They talk about the different technologies and the failures and the successes they have, which we use in the sales department.
Right.
So, and there's a copious amount of abstracts and other stuff that we can pull and utilize, again, not about our product, but about utilizing products like ours.
That's right.
I just want to expand a little bit too, because you brought up some great points. With a coding, what's so critical is that application takes in both clinical, regulatory, takes in all the abstracts, and so the information is very vital, and it goes before the AMA. If it's for a reimbursement with a physician, otherwise it goes through CMS if it's product. It is so critical because many times when you're lobbying the AMA for a new code, it takes about 18 to 36 months. The information the clinical information, the regulatory information that is actually put into that application is so critical, and you have to have actually champions, physician champions, who understand the technology, understand the application, and then getting an entire group to actually vote and agree that they're going to then give you a new code. In addition, they do the mapping, which is the relative value units that attribute to the value and the amount of funds that are actually going to be applied for the level of care that's going to be, if it is for physician services. So I keep that in mind too, is that many times we don't think of how important, but somebody who's doing the application is going to say, I need A, B, and C to make sure I can, that this is actually the claims that we're making to the FDA are also the claims we're making to CMS and the AMA, so that we actually can get a code, get the relative value units, and then, of course, we use the abstracts and such for medical policy. But really important.
Good point.
Well, I really want to thank all of the team here for everything that you've contributed, and I just wanted to, come back to our little fireside here and have everybody just give us their final words. What is your one takeaway that you'd like to take, the audience to take from this little fireside chat?
I would simply say know what you do well, and know that what you do well matters to your customers. Make sure that you have clearly identified what problem your product is solving at the hospital level, and then make sure you are in alliance with the person that you're going to hope buy that product, that they agree with you.
Great. Stephanie?
I think bringing together all of these critical cross-functional members at the beginning is paramount to be able to really bring it to the product to market right the first time.
From my perspective, I would say keep the building blocks of coding, coverage, and payment and part of the integration. Keep that in mind, because I refer to it as show me the money. It's the only way that any of us actually are be able to move forward in this frontier of healthcare. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone.